Joe Calloway had 4 minutes to save an $11 million deal when a man from her own firm stepped in front of the clients and told them she did not fit the property she had spent 3 weeks selling them. Marcus Delgado, senior partner at Sterling and Vance Realty, said it loud enough for the whole lobby to hear. "Let me handle this. Clients like this need someone who fits the property." The marble lobby of the Sterling and Vance downtown office went quiet. Joe stood there in her tailored navy blazer, portfolio still open in her hands, and felt the heat crawl up her neck. Fits the property. She knew exactly what he meant. Behind Marcus, the Whitfields exchanged an awkward glance, and one of the junior agents near the coffee station actually smirked. "I've been running this account for 3 weeks," Joe said, keeping her voice level, professional, the way she'd trained herself to sound, no matter how her stomach twisted. "I know their budget, their timeline, and I know how to close an $11 million listing," Marcus said, already turning his back to her, already reaching for the Whitfield's hands like she'd simply evaporated. "Go pull comps for the Lawson file. That's more your speed." Joe didn't move for a full 3 seconds, long enough to feel every eye in that lobby land on her, long enough to remember why she used to cry in her car after shifts, her first year at this firm, long enough to decide, again, that she wasn't going to give any of them the satisfaction of watching her flinch. She turned and walked to her desk with her chin level and her shoulders back, and if her hands were shaking when she sat down, no one needed to know that either. That was the world Joe lived in, a world where her numbers were the best in the office, where she'd closed more listings above asking price than anyone under 35 at Sterling and Vance, and where none of it mattered the second a client looked at her and decided a curvy woman in a size 16 blazer didn't belong walking them through a 12,000 square foot mansion. She'd learned to swallow it. She'd learned to let the winds speak when her presence apparently couldn't. What she hadn't learned, not yet, was that somewhere across the city, a man was reading her name off a file for entirely different reasons. Damian Moretti did not attend real estate showings. He did not personally review property listings, did not sit in on closings, did not so much as glance at square footage, unless it mattered to something far larger than a house. But when his lawyer, Elias Grant, slid a manila folder across the mahogany table in his Lincoln Park office and said the name Calloway, Damian's hand stopped halfway to his scotch. "Say that again." "Calloway, Josephine Calloway." Elias tapped the folder. "She's the listing agent handling the Ashcombe estate. And before you ask, yes, her father was Richard Calloway." The room went still in the particular way rooms went still around Damian. Not from fear exactly, but from the sense that something dangerous had just shifted position. He didn't raise his voice. He never did. That was, people often said, the most unsettling thing about him. The stillness, right before he moved. "Richard Calloway's daughter is selling real estate in this city," Damian said slowly, "and nobody thought to tell me." "Nobody knew to look," Elias said. "She goes by Joe, different last name on some records early on. Her mother remarried for a while. She's clean, Damian. No connections, no contact with anyone from that world. She's just a realtor, a damn good one, from what I can tell." Damian set the glass down without drinking. 8 years ago, Richard Calloway had been a name in a file he hadn't wanted opened. The lawyer who'd gotten too close to a laundering operation running through downtown property deals. The man whose accident had been anything but. The loose thread Damian's own father had ordered cut, before Damian was old enough to have a say in it. Damian had inherited the empire. He hadn't inherited the excuse. "The Ashcombe estate," Damian said. "Who's selling it?" "Private owner. Moving overseas. Sterling and Vance has the listing. 11.2 million. Buy it." Elias blinked. "Damian, you don't need a 14-bedroom mansion in Winnetka." "I didn't ask what I need." Damian finally lifted the glass, and when he spoke again, his voice had dropped into the register that made grown men in his organization go very quiet, very fast. I want to meet her, not through a phone call, not through paperwork with someone else's signature on it. I want her walking me through every room of that house personally, and I want it to look like nothing more than a very expensive man buying a very expensive property. And if she asks why a stranger's suddenly requesting her specifically, Damian almost smiled. Almost. Then she'll find out I don't like being told no by real estate offices, the same way I don't like being told no by anyone else. By 4 the next afternoon, Joe's phone rang with a call that made her sit up straight at her desk. Marcus's assistant, breathless, telling her that a private buyer, a Mr. D. Moretti, had submitted a full-price cash offer on the Ashcombe listing, on one non-negotiable condition. He would only tour the property, and only sign, with Josephine Calloway as his agent. No one else. Marcus appeared at her desk within the minute, his face doing something complicated between confusion and barely concealed resentment. And for the first time in 3 years, he looked at her the way she'd always wanted to be looked at Sterling and Vance. Like she mattered. "Don't get used to it," he said, tossing the file onto her desk, like it cost him something physical to do it. "Client wants you, client gets you. Don't screw this up." Joe looked down at the name on the cover page. Moretti. She didn't recognize it, had no reason to feel the small, cold prickle at the back of her neck as she opened the folder. But some instinct, buried deep and unexplainable, told her that whatever walked through the door of the Ashcombe estate tomorrow morning was going to change something. She just didn't yet know it would change everything. The Ashcombe estate sat behind iron gates in Winnetka, a limestone giant, with lake views that made even seasoned agents lower their voices on the grounds. Joe had shown the house 11 times in 3 weeks. She knew which floorboards in the west wing creaked, knew the exact angle where morning light hit the great room, knew how to talk about the wine cellar without sounding like she was reading from a script. What she didn't know was how to prepare for the man who stepped out of the black Mercedes at 9 sharp the next morning. He was tall in a way that seemed to rearrange the space around him, dressed in a charcoal suit that fit like it had been made for exactly that body, and when he looked at her, Joe had the distinct sensation of being read rather than seen. No dismissive once-over, just a long, level, assessing look, like he already knew things about her she hadn't said yet. "Mr. Moretti," she said, extending a hand that stayed steady. "Joe Calloway, thank you for choosing Sterling and Vance." "I didn't choose Sterling and Vance." His hand closed around hers, brief, firm, gone. "I chose you." The words landed too direct for small talk, and Joe felt her professional smile falter for half a second. "Well, I'll try to earn that. Shall we start with the West Wing?" He walked beside her through the house, saying almost nothing, and Joe understood his silence wasn't disinterest. It was scrutiny she'd never experienced from a client. He didn't ask about square footage or school districts. In the library, he ran 2 fingers along a leather-bound book and asked, without looking at her, whose house was this originally? The Ashcombes built it in 1987. Textile money. Current owner bought it 11 years ago. Joe watched him. "Is there something specific you're looking for, Mr. Moretti?" "Everything's relevant." He turned, something almost like interest crossing his face. "You know this house better than the listing sheet. Most agents didn't spend 3 weeks memorizing every water stain in the basement, so a nervous buyer wouldn't walk away." She hadn't meant that much edge, but something about him made her want to prove she wasn't standing there decoratively. "I do my job well, Mr. Moretti. You seem like a man who prefers things stated plainly." Something flickered in his expression. Surprise, maybe. They moved through the dining room, the kitchen, the glass-walled sunroom, and Joe kept waiting for the moment he'd mention her size, suggest someone else handle the master suite tour. It didn't come. Instead, he asked odd, specific questions about sightlines from the upper windows and the placement of the perimeter gate. Questions that struck her as strange for a man buying a home rather than fortifying one. "You ask a lot of questions about security for a house you're going to live in," she said, climbing the grand staircase. Damian's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "I like to know what I'm protecting." Protecting the house? Protecting what matters. He didn't elaborate, and something in his tone made her stop on the landing. "I don't like being managed, Mr. Moretti." She said it evenly, but there was steel under it. "If there's a reason you're really here, beyond the house, I'd rather you tell me outright than have me find out sideways." For a moment, something flickered across his face, close to being caught. "Everyone in this business manages someone, Ms. Calloway. You manage clients into offers every day. I sell houses. I don't hide reasons." She held his gaze, unwilling to back down the way she suspected most people did with him. "If I'm going to keep walking you through this house, I want to know I'm not being used for something I don't understand." "You're not being used." His voice had dropped, quieter than before. "Not the way you mean." It wasn't an answer, and they both knew it. But something about the way he said it, careful, almost apologetic, kept her from pushing further. At the top of the stairs, they nearly collided with a woman coming from the opposite hallway. Sharp-featured, dressed in white too crisp for a random Tuesday, who stopped short at the sight of Damian and blinked in what looked, for a fraction of a second, like genuine alarm, before her face smoothed into practiced charm.
"Damian!"
"I didn't realize you'd be here today." Her eyes slid to Joe, cataloging her, dismissing her, in under 2 seconds. "I was having my own agent walk me through properties nearby. Small world. Isabel." Damian's voice went flat, controlled in a way that made Joe's instincts prickle. "You're looking at real estate in Winnetka. A girl needs options." Isabel's smile was all teeth, especially with everything so unsettled lately. "You understand." The exchange lasted less than 30 seconds, but Joe felt the temperature of the hallway drop, felt something pass between them that had nothing to do with real estate. Isabel left with a lingering glance back at Joe, less curiosity than measurement, a face she intended to remember. "Old acquaintance?" Joe asked once they were alone in the master suite. "Former fiancé." Damian's voice was clipped, final, a door closing. "We're finished with the tour." Something about the way he said it told her not to ask more, but she filed it away anyway, out of the same sharp attentiveness that had made her the best agent at Sterling & Vance, even when nobody wanted to admit it. They finished the walkthrough in near silence. At the front door, Damian turned to her, expression unreadable. "I'm making an offer today. Full price, cash, 30-day close." He paused. "And I want you handling every step personally. Not Delgado, not anyone else at your firm. That's unusual, but I can arrange that." "Good." He started toward the car, then stopped, half turning back. "You didn't ask why I chose you over anyone else at your firm." "I figured you'd tell me if you wanted me to know." For the first time all morning, Damian Moretti almost smiled. "Careful, Miss Calloway. That kind of patience is either very smart or very dangerous." He got into the Mercedes without another word, and as it pulled away, Joe stood on the front steps with her pulse, doing something it had no business doing over a client, and a name, Isabel, sitting uneasily in the back of her mind, like a splinter she couldn't work loose. She didn't know Isabel Reyes had already made a call from her car, voice low and urgent, telling someone on the other end that Damian had a new real estate agent, and that they needed to find out exactly who Josephine Calloway was, and how much she knew. The closing on the Ashcombe estate moved unusually fast, and within a week, Joe found herself spending more hours in Damian Moretti's orbit than with any client in her career. He requested her at every walkthrough, every inspection, every meeting with the title company, always with the same terse insistence. Calloway handles it, or I walk. Marcus had stopped complaining out loud, though Joe caught him watching her with a narrow, calculating look whenever Damian's name came up. She ignored it. For the first time in years, she was too busy actually being good at her job to worry about being seen as good at it. It was during the final walkthrough, 3 days before closing, that everything nearly went sideways. The inspector had flagged a structural concern in the East Wing foundation, a hairline crack that could mean nothing, or could mean $200,000 in repairs, and the seller's team was already threatening to walk if Damian's side made it a sticking point. Joe spent the entire night before poring over structural reports she had no formal training to read, calling a contractor friend from college at 11 p.m., cross-referencing county records back to 1987. By morning, she had built a case that preempted every argument the seller's lawyers were likely to make, complete with comparable repair costs, an independent second inspection she'd arranged out of her own pocket, and a negotiation strategy that saved Damian close to $150,000 without losing the deal. She presented it in the dining room with the seller's attorney, Marcus, and Damian, all seated around the table, and watched Marcus's face go through several stages of disbelief as she spoke. Clear, confident, unshakable, dismantling every objection before it could be raised. The seller's attorney folded, agreeing to a credit at closing. Marcus mumbled something about a call. Damian said nothing until the room had emptied, until it was just the two of them in a mansion that would soon belong to him. "You didn't have to do half of that," he said. "The independent inspection came out of your own pocket. I don't like walking into a fight without knowing I'm right." Joe closed her laptop, aware of him watching her in that unnervingly attentive way. "You're paying $11 million for this house. The least I can do is make sure you're not overpaying for cracks that don't exist. Most agents would have let the deal collapse, rather than spend their own money proving a point." "Most agents aren't me," she said it simply, and something in Damian's expression flickered again. That same almost surprise from the library, like he kept expecting her to disappoint him and kept being wrong. "Have dinner with me," he said. "Not a date, a business dinner. I find I do better work when I'm not talking to someone across a conference table." Joe hesitated, but something in his voice, controlled, careful, like he was testing his own restraint by asking at all, made her curious enough to say yes. That afternoon, before the dinner, Elias had sat across from Damian, with a thin file open between them, running through everything he'd pulled on Josephine Calloway that week. Tax records, old addresses, a college transcript, nothing that read as dangerous, all of it circling back to one line that made Damian go still each time he saw it. "Father deceased, 2018, single vehicle accident. There's nothing here that says she knows anything," Elias had said, "but I'd keep digging before you decide that's true." They ate at a private room in a restaurant on the river, and for 2 hours, Damian Moretti was almost human. He asked about her work, really asked, listening in that same total way he did everything. He told her, with visible reluctance, that his family had interests in property development, real estate, logistics. Vague words Joe noted, but didn't push on. The same instinct that told her not to press about Isabel. Near the end of the meal, he asked, almost too casually, "Your father, Richard Calloway. He was an attorney, wasn't he?" Joe's fork stopped halfway to her plate. "How do you know that?" "I did some research before our first meeting. It's standard practice before letting someone handle an $11 million transaction." Damian's eyes didn't leave her face. "He passed when you were young. Car accident. I was 21. The old, practiced answer came out flat, automatic. "It's not something I discuss much." "I'm sorry," Damian said, and something about how he said it, quiet, deliberate, like the words cost him something, made her look up at him more closely. "You knew him," she said slowly. It wasn't a question. Damian didn't answer right away. "I knew of him," he finally said. "Chicago's a smaller city than people think, at a certain level." She wanted to press further, but the look on his face had closed again, the same door from the mansion hallway, and she understood. This wasn't a door she'd be allowed through tonight. She didn't know that 3 miles away, Isabel Reyes was sitting across from a man named Victor Sorrento, head of the Sorrento family, Damian's oldest rival, sliding a folder across a glass table with Joe Calloway's photograph clipped to the front. "Richard Calloway's daughter," Isabel said. "Damian's new pet real estate agent. I want to know if she knows anything about what her father found 8 years ago. And if she doesn't," her smile went thin and cold, "I want to know how fast we can make sure she never does." Victor studied the photograph. "You think Damian's getting sentimental? Digging up old ghosts?" "I think Damian doesn't do anything without a reason," Isabel said. "And if he's circling Richard Calloway's daughter, he's circling the file that got Richard Calloway killed. We have a problem, Victor. A problem in a nice blazer who doesn't know she's standing on a landmine." Joe sat in her car after dinner, replaying the strange, careful way Damian had said "I knew of him," unaware that somewhere in Isabel's folder was a photograph of her father's overturned car from 8 years ago, and a name, redacted in every official report, connecting his death to a family she'd never once heard of, her own. The weeks that followed blurred into something Joe hadn't expected. Not quite friendship, not quite business. A strange orbit where Damian found reasons to keep her close that had less to do with real estate and more with something neither of them said out loud. He called about additional properties that never materialized into actual listings. He showed up to industry events he had no business attending, standing at the edges of rooms, watching her work a room the way she watched houses, carefully, completely. It was at a charity gala for a downtown arts foundation that Joe saw a different side of him for the first time. She'd worn the green dress her sister had talked her into buying, the one that made her feel like she took up exactly the right amount of space, and she'd been making polite conversation with a client when she heard a voice behind her, familiar, mocking, the kind that had haunted every industry function she'd ever attended. "Joe Calloway. Wow. Didn't expect to see you somewhere with a dress code." Trent Halbrook, a broker who'd made a habit of jokes at her expense for years, grinned over his champagne glass, loud enough for the people nearby to hear. "Guess Sterling and Vance is scraping the barrel these days. Or did they finally figure out fat girls need jobs too?" The words landed like a slap. Joe felt her face go hot, felt the old instinct to shrink, to laugh it off. She opened her mouth to say something when a voice cut through the space beside her, low and absolutely without warmth. "Say that again." Trent turned, still grinning, until he saw who'd spoken, and the grin died on his face. Joe had never seen anyone go pale that fast. "Mr. Moretti, I didn't realize. I asked you to repeat what you said to Ms. Calloway." Damian hadn't raised his voice. He didn't need to. Every person within 10 feet had gone quiet. "I want to make sure I heard it correctly before I decide what to do about it. It was a joke. I didn't mean." "You did mean it. That's what made it worth saying out loud." Damian stepped closer, and Joe watched a man who ran a multi-million-dollar brokerage practically fold under the weight of his attention. "Your firm handled the financing on my Winnetka property last month. I'll be having a conversation with your managing partner about which of his employees he lets represent him in public. Start rehearsing an apology. Not to me, to her." Trent's apology came out garbled, and he disappeared into the crowd so fast, Joe almost laughed despite herself. When she turned to Damian, she found none of his usual careful control in his face. "You didn't have to do that," she said quietly. "Yes, I did." His jaw was tight. Nobody talks to you like that. Not while I'm standing there. And if you weren't standing there. Something dark crossed his face. Then I'd hear about it later, and it would be considerably worse for him. They ended up on the terrace, the lake wind cutting cold across the balustrade, and Joe studied him in the low light, the tension still in his shoulders, hands curled into loose fists. That reaction, she said, it wasn't just about manners. Damian was quiet for a long moment. My brother used to say things like that. About himself. He struggled with his weight his whole life. Got it from every direction, family included. And I watched people tear him down for years before I understood what it was doing to him. By the time I did something about it, it was too late to matter. His voice had gone flat, controlled. I don't let it happen in front of me anymore. To anyone. What happened to him? He died. 2 words, offered like a closed door, and Joe understood she wasn't getting further than that tonight. I'm sorry, she said, and meant it. Damian looked at her, something unguarded in his face she hadn't seen before. You're the only person who's asked me a real question about him in 5 years. Everyone else offers condolences and changes the subject. I'm not everyone else. No, Damian said quietly, and the way he looked at her then made her stomach flip in a way she immediately tried to talk herself out of. You're really not. The moment stretched, charged, and Joe felt herself leaning fractionally closer before catching herself. Some sharp internal alarm reminding her this man was a client, that a man with his kind of controlled danger didn't get involved with women like her without some hidden cost. She stepped back first. I should head home, early showing tomorrow. Something flickered across his face, disappointment, quickly hidden. I'll have my driver take you. That's not necessary. It wasn't a request. He said it gently this time, and Joe found she didn't mind as much as she probably should have. It was in the car, alone, phone lighting up with a text from an unknown number, that the evening curdled into something colder. Joe frowned at the screen, at a message with no name attached, just 5 words that made her blood go still. Ask Damian about your father. Her hands were still shaking when she called him back instead of going home. He picked up on the second ring, voice warm, still carrying the ease of the terrace. Miss me already? Someone just texted me to ask you about my father. She heard her own voice go flat, clinical, the way it did when she was holding something together by force. Do you know something about him, Damian? Something you haven't told me? The silence on the line lasted only a second, but it was long enough. She heard it. The exact half-beat, where a man who never hesitated. Joe, that's not something we should talk about over the phone. That's not a no. It's complicated, and tonight isn't. Just tell me if you know something. Her voice cracked, and she hated it. Please. I can't. Not yet. His voice had gone careful, controlled, the same tone he used on everyone else, and hearing it, turned on her, felt like a door closing in her face. You have to trust me. I don't even know what you are to me, Joe said quietly, and you're asking me to trust you with my own father's memory. She ended the call before he could answer, and sat in the dark of the car, feeling the warmth of the whole evening curdle into something colder, sharper, the unmistakable sense that she'd let a stranger further into her life than she'd let anyone in years, and he was already keeping secrets from her, the way everyone else in this city seemed to be. She didn't call him again that night. Neither did he. 4 days passed after that phone call, and Damian didn't reach out to explain, and Joe didn't call to ask again. The silence between them sat heavier than any argument would have, both of them circling the same unanswered question. What do you know about my father? Like it might detonate if either one touched it first. Joe told herself it didn't matter. She had a business to run. Then Marcus called her into his office on a Thursday morning, and the look on his face told her something worse than silence was coming. Sit down, Joe. She didn't like the way he said her name. Careful, rehearsed. She sat. There's been a complaint filed against you, Marcus said, sliding a folder across his desk without meeting her eyes. From the Ashcombe seller's attorney. He's alleging you withheld material information about the structural inspection to push the deal through. That you knew about a second, more serious foundation issue and buried it in favor of closing the commission. That's not true. Joe's voice came out sharper than she intended. I found that crack. I paid for a second inspection out of my own pocket to make sure Mr. Moretti wasn't overpaying. I have documentation for every step. He has documentation too. Marcus finally looked at her, and what she saw wasn't malice. It was something worse. Doubt. Emails, Joe. From your account, referencing a second structural report that flags settlement issues throughout the foundation. A report you allegedly never disclosed. I never wrote those emails. They're from your login, your IP address. Marcus's voice was quiet now, almost apologetic. The firm has to take this seriously. I have to suspend you pending investigation. I'm sorry. The word investigation rang in her ears, the whole walk back to her desk, where two junior agents suddenly found reasons not to look at her, where whispers started before she'd finished packing her bag. She called Damian from the parking garage, hands shaking so badly she had to redial twice. They're saying I hid information from you, she said, the second he picked up, her voice thin and unfamiliar, even to her own ears. About the foundation. They have emails, Damian. Emails I never sent, and I don't understand how anyone could put my name on something I never wrote. Send me everything you have, Damian said, voice clipped, already calculating. Don't talk to anyone else at your firm until I've seen it. But when the documents arrived at his office an hour later, and Joe sat across from him in the same dining room where she'd once dismantled an inspection dispute with total confidence, something in his face had changed. He read in silence, jaw tight, and when he finally looked up, there was a flicker of something she'd never seen, directed at her before. Uncertainty. These emails have your signature, your login credentials, timestamps matching your work hours. If I didn't know you, I'd say this was fairly damning. But you do know me. Joe heard her own voice crack, hated it, pressed forward anyway. I would never bury information that could hurt you financially. I spent my own money proving that crack was real. Why would I turn around and hide something worse? I don't think you did. A beat before it came, a half-second of hesitation. Joe felt like a blade between her ribs. But I need to know for certain. I have people who can trace the IP addresses, verify the login times. You need to know for certain. Joe stood, chair scraping back. The humiliation of Trent's comment, nothing compared to watching this man, who'd stood between her and every insult the world had thrown at her, look at her like she might be lying, after everything. You still need proof. Joe, no. I understand. Her voice had gone dangerously calm. I built my entire career, proving myself twice as hard as anyone else, because people decide in advance what I'm capable of. I thought, stupidly, that you were different. But I guess even you needed a folder of evidence to believe I'm not a liar. That's not what this is. It's exactly what this is. She grabbed her bag, refusing to let him see her cry. I'll have my lawyer send whatever documentation you need. Good luck with the house, Mr. Moretti. She walked out with her spine straight and did not look back to see Damian's face. Torn, furious at himself, at Isabel, whose name he already suspected belonged somewhere in this, at his own hesitation that had cost him the one thing he hadn't realized he couldn't afford to lose. By evening, the story had traveled through Chicago's real estate circles with the speed reserved for other people's downfall. Her phone filled with messages she didn't answer, some cruel, some quietly gloating, a few from people she'd once considered friends, now suddenly certain they'd always known something was off about her. Jo sat alone in her apartment, staring at the framed photo of her father, tie loosened, smiling at a camera 8 years and a lifetime ago, and wondered if this was how it had started for him too. A single doubt, planted by the right person, in exactly the right ear. She didn't see the message that arrived on Damian's phone an hour later, from Elias. Found the source. Emails weren't sent from her IP. They were routed through a proxy, registered to a shell company. One Isabel Reyes has used before. And she didn't see, 3 miles away, Isabel Reyes pouring herself wine, smiling with quiet satisfaction, believing she'd successfully cut the one thread that could unravel everything she and Victor Sorrento had spent years building, with no idea the forged emails had left a fingerprint, leading directly back to her. Elias Grant didn't wait for morning. He drove to Damian's penthouse at 11 that night, with a laptop under his arm, and an expression that made Damian set down the report he'd been staring at without reading for 2 hours. The emails weren't sent from Joe's account, Elias said, not bothering with a greeting. They were spoofed, routed through a proxy, registered to a shell company called Faro Logistics. It surfaced 18 months ago in the paperwork behind Isabel's last venture, back when she was laundering Sorrento money through import contracts. Damian felt something cold and precise settle into his chest. She set Joe up. It gets worse. Elias turned the laptop around. There is no second structural survey. Someone fabricated the entire document, attached it to spoofed correspondence, and fed it straight to the seller's attorney, bypassing Joe, bypassing Sterling and Vance, going to the one person who'd escalate it fastest. Why would Isabel care about a real estate transaction enough to fabricate a fraud complaint? That's what worries me. Elias hesitated. 15 years, and Damian had never seen him hesitate before delivering bad news. I found the file our people buried 8 years ago, flagged under your father's authority. Calloway wasn't just an attorney who got too close to a laundering operation. He'd built a case. Names, transaction records, wire trails, enough to take down 3 families, including ours and the Sorrentos. The order to shut him down came from your father's office. The order to make it look like an accident came from Isabel's father, before he died, before Isabel folded his connections into her arrangement with Victor. Damian sat very still, absorbing it. Isabel, engaged to him for 2 years, sharing his table, while her father's blood sat on a dead man's file, 8 years cold. She knew, Damian said, the day at the Ashcombe estate. She didn't run into us by accident. Then Joe isn't just collateral in a business dispute. Damian was already reaching for his phone. She's a target. His call went to voicemail. His second call did too. By the third, the cold precision in his chest had curdled into something closer to panic. He sent 2 men to her building. They called back 9 minutes later. Her apartment door was open. Her purse still on the counter. Phone shattered on the kitchen floor. A single overturned chair. The only sign anything had happened. Quiet, efficient, professional. Joe Calloway was gone. Damian stood in the wreckage 20 minutes later, staring at her cracked phone, at an unsent text to her sister, cut off mid-sentence. Something's wrong. I think someone's been in my... He didn't remember dialing Elias, didn't fully register his own voice giving orders in a tone none of his men had heard in years. The tone that meant every resource he had was about to be spent finding one woman before someone made sure she was never found. He had let her walk out believing he doubted her. Now, because of that doubt, she might not live long enough to hear him say he was wrong. Joe woke to the smell of concrete and motor oil, wrists zip-tied, head throbbing where something had struck her in her own kitchen. A warehouse, corrugated walls, a caged light, wind rattling a loose panel above. 2 voices, one young, nervous. One older, calm, finishing a call she couldn't hear the other side of. "She's awake," the younger one said. The older man crouched in front of her. Not cruelty, just the flat indifference of a man who did this work often enough it no longer touched him. "Ms. Calloway, my employer just wants to ask you some questions." He opened a folder to a photograph that made her breath catch. Her father, younger, healthier, outside a courthouse. He spent his last year building a case against several powerful families. "We need to know what he told you, what he left you." "I was 21 when he died. He didn't tell me anything about his cases." It was the truth, and she watched him not believe a word of it. "My employer is fairly convinced you're lying, and she's not known for her patience." Joe thought of Isabel at the top of the Ashcombe staircase. "Isabel Reyes sent you." She forged those emails. What did my father find that scares her this much? "You have until morning to remember something useful." He left her alone in the caged light. Joe spent the next hours working the problem, not the fear. The zip ties were sloppy, amateur. She'd learned in a self-defense class that plastic broke easier than people thought, if you knew the angle. An hour before dawn, it finally snapped. She found a service door with a rusted lock that gave after 3 kicks, and slipped into a pre-dawn Chicago that smelled like rain and river water. She was 3 blocks into a desperate walk toward a gas station sign when the black Mercedes screeched to a stop beside her, and Damian was out before it fully stopped, crossing the distance barely restrained from breaking into a run. Joe. Her name came out raw, stripped of every ounce of his usual control, his hands shaking when they found her shoulders. "Are you hurt? Tell me you're not hurt." "I'm okay." Her voice cracked. 3 days of terror finally catching up now, that she wasn't alone with it. "They knew about my father, Damian. They said Isabel sent them. I don't understand what any of this is about." "I know." His arms were around her before she finished the sentence. "I should have told you the second I found out." "I'm sorry." "Found out what?" She pulled back enough to see his face. Guilt, grief, a fear so raw it frightened her more than the warehouse had. "What aren't you telling me?" The city woke slowly around them, gulls crying over the water, and when he finally spoke, his voice had gone hollow. "Your father didn't die in an accident," Damian said. "He was killed because of what he found, and I think my family had something to do with why." Joe opened her mouth to answer, and that was when Damian's phone buzzed once, sharp, against his knee. He glanced at the screen, and whatever color had returned to his face drained out again. A photograph. Joe, unconscious, in the warehouse, time-stamped hours old, sent from a blocked number, 3 words beneath it. "She isn't safe." "That's not possible," Damian said quietly, staring at a picture taken while she was still tied up, still supposedly alone. "Nobody outside my men knew where you were held. Which means someone in my own organization is talking to Isabel, or she already knows you're free, and she's telling us she can find you again, anywhere, anytime she wants." They sat in the back of the Mercedes as it wound through empty pre-dawn streets. Joe wrapped in Damian's suit jacket, a paramedic checking the cut on her scalp. Neither of them mentioned the photograph again, not yet. Damian had already dispatched 2 men to sweep his own organization for the leak, voice cold in a way that told Joe he intended to find whoever had taken it before the sun was fully up. For now, there was more sitting behind his eyes, something he'd carried alone for hours. 8 years ago, Damian said finally, your father was building a case, money laundering through commercial real estate, shell companies, inflated property values, cash moving through construction contracts that didn't exist. He'd connected it to 3 families. Mine, the Sorrentos, and a third that doesn't exist as an organization anymore. He stared straight ahead, jaw tight. My father gave the order to shut the investigation down, buy him off, threaten him. whatever it took to make the case disappear before it reached a grand jury. He didn't take the money. Joe's voice was steady, but her hands, wrapped around a water bottle someone had pressed into them, were not. That doesn't sound like him. No, he didn't. Damian's hands tightened on his knees. The order to make him disappear entirely, to stage the accident, that came from Isabel's father, not mine. My father wanted him bought or intimidated into silence. Isabel's father wanted him gone. He acted without authorization, and by the time anyone in my family found out what he'd done, it was already finished. And you knew this. When? Joe's voice had gone very quiet, very careful. When did you find out, Damian? 3 days ago, the night you were taken. He turned to look at her, guilt unmistakable, raw in a way she'd never seen. I swear, Joe, I didn't know before that. I knew of your father's name from a file, knew there'd been an incident my father's organization was tangentially connected to, but not the details, until Elias dug in after the emails were exposed as forgeries. There's something else Elias found, Damian said, quieter now, like the words cost him something different than the rest. Your father had enough evidence to name me personally in that case file. I was 22, barely involved in anything, but my name was on transfers I didn't fully understand at the time. He could have used it. Instead, in his own handwritten notes, he crossed my name out of the draft complaint, wrote one line in the margin. Boy shouldn't pay for his father's ledger. He protected me, Joe. Before either of us ever knew the other existed, your father made a choice that kept me out of a federal indictment I didn't even know I'd dodged. Joe stared at him, something in her chest cracking open, in a way she hadn't expected. He never told anyone, not even us. He didn't do it to be thanked. Damian's voice had gone rough. He did it because he believed people deserved to be judged for what they'd actually done, not what they'd been born into. I've spent 8 years believing my family owed his nothing but silence. Turns out we've owed him, and you, a debt I didn't even know existed until 3 days ago. But you knew enough to buy a mansion just to meet me. It landed between them like something breaking. That first day at the Ashcombe estate, that wasn't a coincidence. Yes, he didn't flinch from it. I saw your name on the file. I wanted to know if Richard Calloway's daughter was a threat to my organization or an innocent bystander who'd built a life with no idea what happened to her father. I bought the house to find out. So this whole thing, Joe's laugh came out broken. The dinners, the gala, standing up for me against Trent. Was any of it real? Or was I just an asset you were assessing? It started that way. Damian's voice cracked. The first genuine crack Joe had ever heard in him. I won't lie to you about that. It started as reconnaissance. But somewhere in that first walkthrough, watching you defend a house you didn't even own, like it was your own reputation on the line, it stopped being reconnaissance and became something I didn't have a name for. By the gala, it hadn't been strategy in weeks. The car had stopped outside her building, though neither moved to get out, and Joe sat with the weight of everything at once. Her father's death rewritten, a stranger's family responsible for the worst day of her life, the man beside her both the reason she'd nearly died and the reason she was alive to be angry about it. There's something else, Damian said. Elias found the original case file. Before he died, your father mailed a duplicate set of records to someone he trusted, in case anything happened to him. We don't know who. But if it's still out there, it's the only thing that can prove Isabel's family ordered his death, prove the Sorrentos were complicit, and clear his name for good. You're saying there's proof he wasn't the dirty lawyer people whispered about at his funeral. Joe's eyes burned. That he was murdered for doing the right thing, and evidence exists to prove it. If we can find it. Damian's hand found hers, careful, asking rather than taking. It doesn't just clear your father's name. It ends Isabel and the Sorrento operation permanently, legally. publicly. Joe looked at their joined hands, at the man who had lied to her by omission from the first day, who had also stood in a hallway and defended her honor without hesitation, who had torn Chicago apart, looking for her, the way no one ever had. "I want to find it," she said finally. "I want to look Isabel in the eye when she realizes it's over." Something fierce and proud moved across Damian's face, chased by worry. "It won't be safe, if she knows we're looking. I've spent my whole life being told I'm not fit for the room I'm standing in." Joe met his eyes, steady now. "I'm done letting people like her decide what I'm capable of. Whatever this takes, I'm in." He studied her, something like awe threading through the exhaustion on his face. "I don't know how to do this without putting you in more danger. But I'm done pretending I don't want to try." Neither of them noticed the car idling half a block down, or the man inside photographing them through the rain-streaked windshield, already composing the message he'd send Isabel. "They're together. They're looking for the file. Move now." The name came to Joe 3 days later, sitting bolt upright in bed at 2 in the morning, with a memory buried for 8 years, surfacing all at once. Her father's oldest friend, a retired judge named Walter Pruitt, who'd given the eulogy at his funeral, who used to send her a card every year, on the anniversary of her father's death, that she'd stopped opening around year 4, because it hurt too much to read. He wouldn't have trusted just anyone, Joe said, pacing Damian's penthouse living room, while Elias worked his laptop at the dining table, and Damian watched her with the careful, focused attention he gave everything that mattered. Walter Pruitt. He was a federal judge, Damian, someone with actual protection, actual standing. If my father needed somewhere safe to send evidence, Walter's exactly the kind of person he'd trust. Elias was already typing. Pruitt retired 4 years ago, lives outside Lake Forest now. If your father sent him anything 8 years ago, there's a chance. There's a chance he's been sitting on evidence that could unravel 2 crime families for 8 years, without knowing what he had, Damian finished grimly. Or a chance Isabel's people already found him. They drove out that afternoon, Damian insisting on 2 additional cars, trailing at a discreet distance, and Joe spent the ride rehearsing what she'd say to a man she hadn't spoken to since she was 22, and too broken by grief to accept his kindness. Walter Pruitt answered his own door, older than she remembered, silver-haired and stooped, his face cascading through shock, then grief, then something close to relief. "Josephine Calloway." His voice wavered. "I wondered if you'd ever come." The manila envelope had sat in his safe deposit box for 8 years, sealed, marked only in her father's hand. "For Joe, if anything happens to me. Open only with someone you trust completely." Walter had never opened it himself, waiting for a day he'd begun to fear would never come. Inside were wire transfer records, shell company documents, and a handwritten ledger naming names Joe didn't recognize, and one she did. Reyes, cross-referenced against falsified transactions, alongside a margin note that made her stomach drop. R. Reyes ordered removal of witness Calloway upon discovery. Confirmed via intercepted call. Source protected. "This is it," Damian said quietly, reading over her shoulder, voice tight between vindication and fury. "This proves Isabel's father ordered the hit. It's dated, sourced, admissible. Enough to bury the Sorrento operation and clear your father's name in the same stroke. They didn't make it back to the city before the first car forced them off the highway. It happened fast, a black SUV clipping their rear bumper hard enough to send Damian's Mercedes spinning across 2 lanes. Joe's scream lost in the shriek of tires and glass, Damian's arm thrown across her chest a half-second before impact, a reflex that spared her worse than the whiplash and the cut above her eyebrow. Their driver was bleeding but conscious. The chase cars, trailing further back, peeled off the shoulder toward them, and through the ringing in her ears, Joe heard Damian shouting orders into his phone, voice sharp with fury. She'd never heard from him. The SUV sped off the moment their escort cars closed the distance, and Joe understood, sitting shaking in the wreckage with the envelope clutched to her chest, that this hadn't been an attempt to kill them. It had been an attempt to take the file. "They know we have it," she said, voice unsteady. "Isabel knows. She's desperate now." Damian's hands were checking her over with barely restrained panic, cataloging every scrape like it might be hiding something worse. Desperate people make mistakes. "This is her mistake, Joe. This just told us she's out of better options." They regrouped at a safe house off any official record, and it was there that night that word came from one of Damian's men near the Sorrento compound, word that turned the fight upside down. Marcus Delgado, Joe's own managing partner, the man who'd suspended her and let the investigation nearly ruin her career, had been photographed entering Victor Sorrento's building twice in the past month. "Marcus!" Joe stared at the surveillance photo, disbelief curdling sharper. He's been feeding them information the whole time. He didn't just believe the forged emails. He helped bury me, because someone paid him to. Damian's expression had gone cold, in a way Joe recognized. The same stillness from the gala, right before Trent's humiliation, sharper now, edged with something far less controlled. "Then Marcus Delgado," Damian said quietly, "is about to learn exactly what it costs to help someone try to destroy the person I love." The word landed in the room, and neither of them acknowledged it out loud, but Joe felt it settle into her chest anyway, a small, fierce warmth in the middle of everything that terrified her. It was the last quiet moment they got that night. 20 minutes later, one of Damian's men burst through the safe house door, breathless, phone already in his hand. "Marcus made a call before we picked him up. Whoever he called knows this address." Damian was moving before the sentence finished, shoving Joe toward the back stairwell, shouting orders Joe couldn't fully follow over the sudden pounding at the front door, the shattering of a window somewhere above them, the acrid bite of smoke already curling under the doorframe from a fire someone had set fast and deliberate to cover a retreat. In the chaos, in the scramble down a fire escape with Damian's hand locked around her wrist, Joe realized, with a horror that emptied her lungs, that the envelope, her father's ledger, the only proof that existed, the thing that could clear his name and bury the people who'd killed him, was still sitting on the safe house table where they'd left it. By the time Damian's men beat back the fire, there was nothing left of it but ash. Joe stood in the wreckage at 3 a.m, staring at a scorched, unreadable smear where her father's handwriting used to be, feeling 8 years of grief collapse back on top of her. Everything they'd fought for, everything Walter had guarded for a decade, gone in 20 minutes, because Marcus Delgado had made one phone call. "It's gone," she whispered. "Damian, it's actually gone." He didn't answer right away, and for one terrible second, standing in the smoke and the dark, Joe watched something break behind his eyes, the look of a man who had promised her this would end differently, and was about to have to tell her it hadn't. Isabel Reyes had built her entire plan on one assumption, that Damian would never risk exposing his own family's history to save a woman he'd known for 6 weeks. She was wrong, and she found out exactly how wrong 3 nights later, at the annual Chicago Preservation Society gala. The fire had taken the original ledger, but not everything. Elias had photographed every page on his phone in Walter Pruitt's study before they'd even left, an old habit from years of handling evidence, too important to trust to a single copy. And the files had already been uploaded to a secure server before the safe house burned. What Isabel's men had destroyed was the physical proof. What they hadn't destroyed was the case itself. And once Damian's lawyers confirmed the digital copies were admissible, what had felt, for one devastating hour, like losing everything, became instead the last piece they needed to finish it. Damian had insisted on the venue deliberately. If Isabel was going to fall, he wanted it to happen in front of every person who mattered to her. The donors, the society families, the careful reputation she'd spent years building on top of her father's blood money. Joe wore red this time, not green, not something safe, a dress that made her feel like armor rather than apology. And when she walked into that ballroom on Damian's arm, she watched the whispers start the way they always did. And for the first time in her life, she didn't shrink from them. Isabel found them within 20 minutes, gliding across the room in ice blue silk, with Victor Sorrento, a careful half-step behind her, her smile sharp enough to cut. Damian, and Ms. Calloway, still standing, I see. How resilient. Isabel! Damian's voice was pleasant, almost warm, and Joe had learned enough about him now to recognize the danger hiding beneath it. I was hoping you'd be here tonight. I wanted you to hear this from me directly, before it becomes public record. Hear what, exactly? That the file your father tried to bury 8 years ago has been recovered. Damian let the words land, watched Isabel's careful composure flicker for the first time all night. Richard Calloway's ledger, wire transfers, your father's own recorded order to remove a witness. It's already in federal hands, Isabel, along with documentation connecting Victor's current operation to 3 active laundering schemes running through Chicago real estate. Victor's face had gone rigid, the practiced charm of a man who'd spent decades feeling untouchable, cracking under something close to panic. You're bluffing. There's no way you... Marcus Delgado made a full statement 2 hours ago, Damian said, and Joe watched with fierce satisfaction. The exact moment Isabel understood her own carefully built empire had a hole in it she hadn't accounted for. Turns out prison sentences for financial fraud make men reconsider their loyalties very quickly. He's confirmed everything. The payments, the forged emails, the instructions to bury Joe's reputation and complaint before she could dig further into the Ashcombe deal. It's all on record now, Isabel. Every piece of it. For a moment, Isabel's mask slipped completely, something ugly and desperate showing through the careful beauty she'd worn, like armor for years. You have no idea what you're doing, she hissed, low enough that only the 4 of them could hear. You destroy me. You destroy the balance that's kept this city from bleeding for a decade. I kept the peace, Damian. I kept your family and mine from tearing each other apart. You kept me lied to for 2 years, while your father's blood stayed on Richard Calloway's grave, Damian said, and his voice had dropped into something Joe had never heard before, quiet and absolutely lethal. You let me believe I loved you. You let me grieve my brother next to you, without ever telling me your family had a hand in destroying an innocent man because he found out what you were. I don't care about balance anymore, Isabel. I care about justice. And tonight, you're finally going to get some. It was Joe who stepped forward then, close enough that Isabel had no choice but to look at her directly, the way she'd refused to at the top of that staircase weeks ago. You had men grab me off my own kitchen floor, Joe said, steady, clear, loud enough now for the small cluster of onlookers nearby to hear every word. You forged emails to destroy a career I built from nothing, in an industry that already tried to convince me I didn't belong every single day. You did it because you were scared of what my father knew, and because you decided a long time ago that people like me don't fight back. You have no idea who you're threatening, Isabel snapped. I'm not threatening you. Joe's voice didn't waver. I'm telling you it's already over. My father spent his life proving that people can't just make inconvenient women disappear when it suits them. Turns out I'm his daughter, in more ways than either of us knew. Federal agents entered through the ballroom's side doors 12 minutes later. Elias's arrangement, timed with surgical precision, the culmination of 3 days of quiet cooperation between Damian's lawyers and a U.S. Attorney's office that had been building a laundering case against the Sorrento organization for years and had just been handed the missing piece. Victor Sorrento was led out in handcuffs past 300 of Chicago's wealthiest families, his empire collapsing in real time under the same chandeliers where he'd once held court like royalty. Isabel didn't go quietly. She turned at the door, finding Damian's eyes one last time across the stunned ballroom, and whatever she said was lost beneath the roar of conversation erupting around them. But Joe saw Damian's face, saw the complicated grief and relief and finality that crossed it, as he watched the last chapter of his old life dragged out in handcuffs. He didn't reach for Isabel. He turned, instead, and found Joe's hand in the chaos, threading his fingers through hers, in front of every person who had once looked at her, and decided she didn't belong in rooms like this. "It's over," he said quietly. "No," Joe said, watching the doors close behind Isabel and Victor, feeling 8 years of grief finally loosen its grip on her chest. "It's just starting." The federal case against the Sorrento organization made national news within a week, and buried inside the reporting, a footnote to most outlets, the whole story to Joe, was the formal exoneration of Richard Calloway, attorney, whose 8-year-old case file had finally been entered into evidence as the foundation of one of the largest financial crimes prosecutions in Illinois history. The papers that had once let his name fade into vague, unspoken suspicion now printed his photograph beside the words, "A lawyer who refused to look away." Joe cried reading it in Damian's kitchen at 6 in the morning, and he didn't try to talk her out of it, just sat beside her with a hand on her back until the worst of it passed, the way he'd learned to do in the months since the gala, not fixing, just staying. Sterling and Vance offered her a full partnership 2 weeks later, along with a written apology from the firm's board and a settlement that made the suspension quietly, expensively, disappear from any record. Joe turned the partnership down. She'd spent 3 years proving her worth to people who'd only ever seen it when it became legally convenient, and she was done building someone else's empire. Marcus Delgado's name never appeared on another listing in Chicago again. Joe heard, secondhand, that he'd taken a plea deal that kept him out of prison, but not out of disgrace, and that the last anyone saw of him, he was selling condos in a city 2 states away, where nobody recognized his face yet. Trent Halbrook sent her a card the month after the gala, an actual handwritten apology, clumsy and overdue, that Joe read once and then quietly let go of, because some people didn't deserve to live rent-free in her thoughts anymore, not even as villains. She opened her own brokerage 6 months after that, Calloway Realty, a small storefront in Lincoln Park, with her father's old law diploma framed on the wall beside her own real estate license. And within a year, she'd hired 2 junior agents she picked specifically because other firms had overlooked them for reasons that had nothing to do with their talent. She built the kind of company she'd needed at 26 and never had. Damian didn't disappear from her life the way she'd half feared he might once the danger had passed. Once there was no case to solve, and no threat to guard against. No reason left, she'd worried privately, for a man like him to want a woman like her in his ordinary, unglamorous days. Instead, he showed up more, not less. He came to her office, opening with a security detail that made her new landlord nervous, and a bouquet so large it had to ride in its own car. He learned, slowly, without her having to explain it more than once, that she didn't need protecting from the world so much as she needed someone standing beside her while she handled it herself. It was almost a year to the day since the Ashcombe estate walkthrough, at a dinner in the same private Riverview room where he'd first asked her real questions instead of small talk, that Damian reached into his jacket with hands that Joe, for the first time since she'd known him, watched actually shake. "I bought a house once," he said, just to meet a woman I'd read about in a file. I told myself it was strategy, reconnaissance. He set a small velvet box on the table between them, didn't open it yet, just held her eyes, the way he had that very first day in the library, reading her like he already knew things she hadn't said. It stopped being strategy the moment you told me most agents weren't you. I've spent every day since trying to figure out how a man like me, who spent his whole life believing love was a weakness other people used against you, ended up needing one person so much that losing her nearly broke something in me I didn't know I had left to break. Damian. I'm not good at easy things, he said, opening the box. And Joe's breath caught at the ring inside. Simple, elegant. Nothing like the ostentatious wealth she'd expected from a man who'd once bought a 14-bedroom mansion on a whim. I'm good at protecting things, at controlling outcomes. You taught me that the people worth keeping don't need to be controlled. They need to be trusted, and stood beside, and chosen, every day, out loud, in front of everyone who ever doubted them. His voice roughened. I want to spend the rest of my life choosing you. Loudly, in every room either of us walks into. Her sister cried harder than Joe did when she called with the news that night, and their mother, who had spent 8 years watching her daughter build herself back up one closed listing at a time, said only, quietly, that their father would have liked him, not for the money or the power, but for the way he'd looked at Joe in the one photo she'd sent, like a man who'd finally stopped needing to control every room he walked into, and had simply chosen, instead, to stand in it beside her. She said yes before Damian finished the sentence, and if her answer came out wet and laughing and inelegant, neither of them cared, because 6 months later, she walked into the same Ashcombe Estate ballroom, Damian's home now, their home, in a dress the color of the sea, past a small crowd that included Marcus Delgado's old junior agents, now hers, past Walter Pruitt, beaming in the front row, past every person who'd once decided at a glance what she was and wasn't capable of, and married a man who'd once bought a mansion just to find out if the file was right about who she really was. It had been. It had simply taken the right person to see it. Years later, when their daughter asked how her parents met, Joe would tell her, half laughing, that a rude man once told her father she wasn't fit to sell luxury homes, and the Mafia boss who overheard it bought the whole mansion just to prove them wrong. It wasn't the whole story. It never would be, not entirely. Some chapters belonged only to the two of them, to the danger and grief and stubborn, hard-won trust that had built something neither of them had believed they deserved. People still whispered about Damian Moretti in certain rooms, still lowered their voices when he walked in, still spoke of him like a man built entirely of power and control. Joe had stopped correcting them. She knew what those rooms didn't, that the most dangerous man in Chicago hadn't been weakened by loving her. He'd been forged by it, the way steel is forged, made stronger for having been tested, made whole in a way all his power alone had never managed. Love hadn't cost him anything he couldn't survive losing. It had simply given him something worth surviving for. But it was, Joe thought every time she told it, exactly true enough.